So this document right here is saddle stapled. It has two staples along the binding. It's called saddle stapled because it sits on a device similar like this that has a saddle on it. The pages are placed like this, and a staple is driven through the spine. Now, if it's not stapled, it's called saddle stitched, and what they do is they use a thread to bind it together. So when we have saddle stitched or saddle stapled, you usually use this form of binding when you don't have a lot of pages. The other form of binding is called perfect bound, which is what this magazine is. So you'll notice that this has a spine on it. And if you look really carefully where the binding has occurred, you'll notice that there's glue right there. And basically, they place a sheet of paper or sheets of paper. They then compress it against this edge, and they put some glue in there, and they just hold it in place, and it's bound. But to do this, it has to be a certain thickness. I believe it has to be 1/4 of an inch minimum. So if I want to do perfect bound, I need 1/4 of an inch worth of paper. How many sheets of paper do you think that is? How many sheets of paper? It's kind of a trick question because it depends. It depends on the stock or the paper that you choose. Some paper's thicker than other. The more premium paper is thicker and heavier. So if you were using a premium stock, it's not going to take a very large page count. But most magazines use a nice sheet of paper, but it's very thin to make it more cost effective. And so it's a very thin stock, you're going to need more sheets of paper to get to 1/4 of an inch. I think a good rule of thumb is that if you're about 75 pages or so, you probably can get to perfect binding, probably. But if you're under 75 pages, you're probably going to have to go to saddle stitched. So both of these formats are important based on what the requirements are for your project. Does that make sense? So if you look at magazines, a lot of them are perfect bound, a lot of them are saddle stitched. It just depends on what is probably more cost effective and functional. And it needs to be a certain size to go to perfect bound. So with that being said, if I am going to go to saddle stitched, which is the smaller page count, you'll notice that if I remove these staples out of this and open this document apart, I would basically get an effect that looks like this. I'm looking for a scrap sheet of paper. So I'm taking a sheet of paper and I'm folding it in half. So a magazine that's been saddle stapled or saddle stitched is a collection of these, right? Sitting on a saddle, right? So this is one sheet of paper, but how many pages is it? How many pages is it? Say it, please. It's 4 pages. It's one sheet of paper, but I have a front and a back. That means I have 2 sides. But on each side, there's a fold where the binding is to occur. So that means I actually have 2 pages per side. With both sides put together, I have 4 pages. So look, InDesign says, how many pages do you want? So if I'm working with a client and I have an idea, it's going to be a magazine or a brochure, it's going to be stapled down the spine, I now know what my page count potentially is. So my page count is in multiples of what? 4. So the more pages, the more what it's going to be. The more paper, the more what is it going to be? Expensive. So the more pages, the more paper, the more expensive. It's more material. So if I'm designing with a client and I'm putting a brochure together, there's a financial component tied to this. So this is a scenario that you might encounter with a client. And by the way, this has happened to me. Okay, so I like to share these scenarios that I've sort of encountered, okay? So I'm pitching to a client, or they're talking to me about what they want done, and we sort of have agreed to work with one another, and they tell me, I'm going to get you the copy, and next week I'll give you the copy. So the next week comes and they give me the copy, and I look at their copy, and they're telling me it's a 13-page document. Is that possible? They're telling me it's a 13-page document. I just explained to you what it's based off of. Is that possible? I can't make a 13-page document. It needs to be either what or what? Well, let's talk about page count. It needs to be, they said 13 pages, 12-pager or 16-pager. So they're telling me they expect 13 pages. So it either has to be 12 or 16. So I have an interesting conversation from this point forward, because the client might have a budget in mind, right? And so, well, what's the cost? They're going to come to me and they're going to say, well, what's the cost for a 12-page document versus a 16-page document? It's one extra sheet of paper, but there's printing involved on both sides of it. So I don't have that answer. I'd have to go to the print vendor to get some quotes and estimates. And then I will supply the difference between a 12-page document, the cost for a 12-page document, versus the cost for a 16-page document. So the client might say, I can afford the 16 pages. I can afford that extra sheet of paper. And everything's great. Now I have more space where I can maybe use more negative space in the document. Maybe I can use more images. Maybe I can make the text bigger. We can make some artistic decisions and some design decisions that might make it more aesthetically pleasing. But let's say the client says, I can't afford the extra sheet of paper. I have to go to 12. Then what is my response to the client? What do you think I have to tell them? They gave me 13 pages worth of text, and it needs to go to 12. What am I going to tell them? You're going to have to edit and figure out what to cut in your content. Yes. So either way, there's a give or a take. They're either going to have to give financially to increase the page count, or they're going to have to sacrifice some of their content to get it to work within that smaller dimension. But I'm pointing this out to you that the software is giving me the ability right off the top of the bat to define the size of my document. And if I'm already thinking about a page number, I should be thinking about what that really means in terms of production. And maybe it's a time or a point to have a conversation with your client about expectations. So that way they understand what's behind all of this, okay? So, because not only are they paying for the sheet of paper, but usually in multiples of 100 to 2,000 to 5,000. So each one of those pages over the scale of the project may be a big factor from a financial standpoint, okay? So just something to keep in mind.